Morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on mechanical ventilation organized by AIIMS New Delhi at its set facility. As you know, the importance of ventilators is supreme in the management of serious patients of COVID-19 pandemic, and in keeping with this, there has been a push to have more and more ventilators for the better management of our patients. However, it's not just the machine, as in everything else, is the man behind the machine, which is very important. And in keeping with this subject, we have organized this webinar so that more and more physicians would be needed to manage ventilators, and it's not the anesthetist who will be doing this if and when, God forbid, the pandemic accelerates and we have more and more patients. So train you and to refresh your knowledge on managing ventilators, we'll have three talks on managing ventilators, and this will be followed by a question answer session. So like previous times, please do keep sending your question answers on the chat box, and we will try to answer as many of them as possible at the end of the session. So we will start the session with the first talk by Dr. Dalim from the Department of Anesthesia, Pain Medicine and Critical.
Good afternoon, everyone. In today's webinar on mechanical ventilation, we'll be discussing various aspects of mechanical ventilation strategy in ICU in a series of talks. In the first talk, I'll be discussing in detail about the ventilator. So when you visit a patient in the ICU and look at the ventilator screen, you'll be seeing a variety of waveforms, different types of curves, scalars, loops. Now these arise because of interaction of the patient with the ventilator. To appropriately manage a patient on mechanical ventilation, we need to know how to interpret these waveforms in detail. Now, as you are aware that in our clinical practice, we have been regularly using various other waveforms like say ECG, pulse oximetry, arterial blood pressure, central venous pressures. All these waveforms we have been using as a diagnostic tool for monitoring various clinical conditions of the patients and as a response to the therapy administered. However, the ventilator graphics and waveforms are less commonly used. This may be because of various. One of the reasons is that there are multiple waveforms present in the ventilator screen, various scalars and loops. So the operator may get confused how to interpret all of them simultaneously in a single patient. And secondly, in ventilators of different models that make, they will have a varied appearance. So once you are comfortable and trained in one ventilator specific model, you may not be very comfortable in the beginning in another ventilator. So we need to have a structured and systematic approach as to how we interpret these various waveforms. So let us start with the various parameters we have. Now, grossly, all these waveforms arise out of interaction of four basic types of parameters: flow, pressure, volume, and time. So when you plot this pressure, flow, and volume in the time axis, that is time in the x-axis, then you get this kind of waveforms which are called scalars. So you have pressure time scalar, flow time scalar, and volume time scalar. It's important to note that the flow time scalar will have flow waveforms both above and below the x-axis, that is the time axis, whereas the other two will be only the positive deflection above the time axis when you are dealing with a patient on positive pressure ventilation. If you leave aside the time and plot the relationship of pressure and volume, you get a pressure volume loop. Similarly, if you plot volume and flow, you get flow volume loop. It's important to note that in pressure volume loop, the volume is in the y-axis, whereas in the flow volume loop, the volume is in the x-axis. Now there can be various shapes of these waveforms. The basic few shapes are square shapes, ascending ramp, descending ramp, sine, or exponential decay. So depending on the type of parameter you have chosen and the mode of ventilation, these shapes can vary. We'll come to that in detail. Now, what is one's respiratory cycle? One's respiratory cycle consists of the inspiration part and the expiration part. So in this figure, look at the middle waveform, which is a flow time scalar, and you can easily appreciate that it has a square waveform pattern. So the flow begins at the beginning of inspiration, reaches its peak at the beginning of inspiration, and it's maintained constantly in a square wave pattern. And when the flow ends, the expiration or the exhalation starts. During this constant flow phase, which is an inspiration phase, the pressure gradually rises in the ascending ramp pattern, and the volume gradually rises to a point when the ventilator cycles into exhalation. Till the start of the next complex, the expiration phase goes on. So the inspiration and expiration phase in combination forms one respiratory cycle. Now there are three different variables. If you analyze each complex of the waveform, you will realize that the ventilation starts with a trigger. Now the point A suggests that this is the trigger. So it can be a time-based ventilation, which is a time-triggered ventilation, or a patient can trigger his own. So now this can be again a flow trigger or a pressure trigger, depending on what the ventilator senses. When a patient initiates a breath, the ventilator can sense change in the flow or change in the pressure in the system, and depending on that, it is called either flow trigger or pressure trigger. Similarly, there will be a parameter which will limit the delivered ventilation, the tidal volume. So this limit can be flow limit in case of volume control, or it can be pressure limit in case of a pressure control. There will be another parameter which will determine when the ventilation will cycle from inspiration to expiration. This is called cycling. So it can be volume cycle in case of a volume control mode, it can be time cycled in case of pressure control mode, or it can be flow cycle in case of pressure support mode. So now let us analyze the scalars of different modes of ventilation. We'll start with the volume control ventilation. The volume control ventilation is one of the most commonly used ventilation mode. So I'll suggest that whenever you look at the scalars, the pressure, flow, and the volume time scalars, first have a look at the scalar which is showing you a square wave pattern. So in this picture, in the middle scalar, you see that it is square wave, and this is a flow time scalar. So that means that this is flow limited ventilation, because flow is square wave pattern, and the flow terminates when a specific amount of volume has been delivered in this case. So the cycling is volume cycling. So to describe it, in the beginning of inspiration, the flow reaches at its peak and flow is maintained in a constant pattern. During this time, the pressure keeps on rising in an ascending ramp pattern, and the volume gets delivered till a point when the preset tidal volume has been delivered. At this point of time, the cycling occurs, and inspiration ends, expiration begins. So this becomes a flow limited and volume cycled ventilation. If the patient triggers this ventilation, this will be patient triggered. However, most of the times in VCB mode, patients are deeply sedated or paralyzed, so ventilator delivers each breath in a timely fashion. So these are time triggered. So the VCB becomes a time triggered, flow limited and volume cycle ventilation mode. In pressure control ventilation, look at again the square wave pattern. It is the pressure time scalar. So this becomes a pressure limited ventilation. The set peak inspiratory pressure is achieved at the beginning of inspiration, and then this pressure is maintained constantly throughout the inspiration phase. And during this phase, to maintain the constant pressure, the initial flow, which was the peak inspiratory flow achieved at the beginning of inspiration, gradually decreases in the descending ramp pattern, and till the time inspiratory time is there, it continues. So this becomes a time cycle ventilation mode, where the constant pressure will be maintained till the inspiratory time, and the flow descends till the end of inspiratory time. And during this time, the volume delivered will depend on the patient's compliance and the resistance. So the pressure control mode becomes a time triggered, pressure limited, and again time cycle ventilation. So to identify the difference between the VCV and the PCV in a nutshell, if you look at the flow time scalar and find that flow time scalar is square wave pattern, and the pressure time scalar is ascending ramp, then it is VCV. Whereas when the pressure time scalar becomes square wave pattern and the flow is descending ramp, it becomes a PCV. Another important point is that in volume control mode, since it's volume cycled and specific amount of volume is delivered during each breath, the volume time scalar, each complex will look similar because similar amount of tidal volume is delivered in each subsequent breath. Whereas in PCV, this can vary because the delivered tidal volume can vary from one breath to another. Now we'll discuss individual scalars separately. So let us first have a look at the pressure time scalar. So this is a figure of pressure time scalar in a patient on volume control ventilation. So in a VCV, the pressure will be ascending ramp pattern. Now look at the figure below. Here the pressure time scalar baseline is shifted up. This is because some amount of positive end expiratory pressure has been applied in the system, and the pressure time scalar operates on and above this PEEP level. So from this image you can actually measure the amount of PEEP which has been administered. Similarly, in this figure, if you observe, you will be finding that there is difference in the pressure time scalar pattern in the figure above and the below. In the figure above, the peak inspiratory pressure achieved at the end of inspiration and then the cycling occurs. However, in the figure below, after the peak inspiratory pressure, there will be a certain amount of time when inspiratory pause has been applied and the pressure drops a little bit and maintained at that phase for some period of time, and then the cycling occurs. So this suggests that an inspiratory pause has been applied, and this is applied to measure the plateau pressure. We'll be discussing it in detail. So if you analyze one complex of this pressure time scalar carefully, you can identify the peak inspiratory pressure and identify the plateau pressure, which is measured by applying the inspiratory pause. You can also identify the inspiratory time as well. Now it's important to realize that this peak inspiratory pressure reflects the pressure required to overcome the resistance and the compliance both, whereas the plateau pressure reflects the alveolar distending pressure, which is inverse to the compliance. So in a patient whose compliance is poor, like a patient with ARDS, low compliance, the plateau pressure will be high, whereas in a patient where compliance is good, the plateau pressures will be low. So if you look at these figures, the upper left one is the normal pressure time curve. When the airway resistance increases, the peak airway pressure will increase. However, the plateau pressure will remain constant. So the difference between the peak pressure and the plateau pressure increases. This reflects that increase in the airway resistance, possibly because of, say, bronchospasm, or many. It can be because of many other reasons as well. Whereas when the compliance becomes low, for example in ARDS, the entire complex, the entire curve will increase. However, the difference between the peak and the plateau pressure will remain constant. The rise will in pressure will be because of rise in the plateau pressure. Now, what is patient triggering? Uh, So as you can understand that the ventilation can be triggered by the patient himself, or it can be time triggered when the patient is not participating in the breathing process, when the patient is sedated or paralyzed. So if you look at the beginning of a pressure time scaler, at the beginning of the each breath, if you find a small notch below, this usually suggests that there is some inspiratory effort by the patient, and this is a patient triggered breath. Now in the expiration phase of the pressure time scaler, you can identify what is called auto peep. Similar to the inspiratory pause or inspiratory hold which is applied to identify the plateau pressure, you can apply an expiratory hold maneuver at the beginning of expiration. In patients, commonly with patients with COPD, who can have expiratory resistance and therefore air trapping inside the lung, and progressively which can cause dynamic hyperinflation. In this group of patients, to identify and quantify the amount of hyperinflation, you can measure auto peep. So if you apply an expiratory hold maneuver at the beginning of expiration phase, the waveform will rise above the baseline peep which was already preset, and from the difference of the peep measured at the end of expiration from the peep which was already set as peep, you can identify the amount of auto peep which has been generated in the system. Now we'll discuss about the flow time scaler. Now in the flow time scaler, again for recap, if you see it's a square wave flow time scaler, it's VCV mode. If you recognize it's a descending ramp flow time scaler, it's a PCV mode. Now from the flow time scaler, the basic information which you easily get is the inspiratory time and the expiratory time, and at the same time you can identify and calculate the peak inspiratory flow rate and the peak expiratory flow rate as well. Now the basic difference between these two types of flow time scalar, the constant flow versus descending flow, is that, or the decelerating flow, is that in constant flow, the flow is maintained constantly during the entire phase of inspiration, so the pressure gradually keeps rising till the end of inspiration when it reaches the peak inspiratory pressure. Whereas in a decelerating flow pattern, the peak flow and the peak pressure is achieved at the beginning of inspiration, and the pressure is maintained constantly throughout the inspiratory cycle as the flow decreases. So it is more physiological because it matches with the patient's inspiratory pattern, and secondly, same tidal volume may be delivered with the use of a decelerating flow pattern with less rise in the peak inspiratory pressure. However, the major drawback is that due to change in the patient's compliance and resistance, the delivered tidal volume may vary significantly in the decelerating flow pattern. Now from the flow time scalar, what more information you can get? Look at this figure. The inspiratory phase, in the inspiratory phase, the flow does not return to the baseline the way it should have been. The dotted line shows the normal descending ramp pattern of the flow time curve. Here what happens, the flow takes longer time to reach to the baseline, and it may not even reach baseline at times. So it suggests that the increased work of breathing is there, possibly because of some airway obstruction, probably inspiratory airway obstruction. This can happen because of maybe you have a smaller size of endotracheal tube, or patient biting the tube, or there is some obstruction in the airway. Similarly, if you see the similar pattern in the expiratory phase of the flow time scalar, here you see that the expiratory flow does not return to the baseline at all, and it takes longer and longer period of time, if at all, if it has to return to the baseline. So it suggests that there is significant expiratory airway obstruction, and the continued flow suggests, and the beginning of the next breath, even before the flow has reached the baseline, suggests that there is significant amount of air trapping has occurred. So this is a characteristic pattern which is observed in COPD patients on mechanical ventilation. From a distance, by identifying the flow time scalar, you can easily understand that there is significant air trapping has occurred, and there are various methods to correct. One of such methods is to administer bronchodilator. So if you see in the left hand side of the figure, if you see this kind of picture where the peak expiratory flow is less and the expiratory time is prolonged, if you administer the bronchodilator and if the expiratory resistance improves, the bronchodilator works, then you will realize that the peak expiratory flow has increased and the expiratory time has reduced significantly. That is, the expiratory flow will reach the baseline earlier than it was before the administration of bronchodilator. Another important utility of this flow time scalar is the adjustment of inspiratory time. In the central scalar, you see the flow should ideally reach the baseline when the inspiration ends. It may not occur always, depending on the inspiratory time you have set in your ventilator. It can happen at times that the cycling occurs even before the flow reaches the baseline. So it suggests that inspiratory time is too short. Whereas in other case, like in the right hand side image, the cycling does not occur even after the flow has reached the baseline. So here it suggests that the inspiratory time is too long. So this kind of picture will suggest that there is mismatch between the mechanical inspiratory time and the patient's neural inspiratory time. This should be corrected. So by looking at the flow time scalar, you can actually titrate and change the inspiratory time to have better matching. Now come to volume time scalar. Pressure time and flow time scalar will give you a wealth of information. Volume time scalar is used a bit less commonly compared to the other two scalars. To identify the difference between VCV and PCV, grossly they look the same. One important difference is that the volume time in the volume control mode, the tidal volume is fixed. So the each subsequent complex of the volume time scalar in VCV mode will look the same. Whereas the volume can vary a little bit in the PCV mode if there is change in the patient's compliance or resistance. So the subsequent waveforms may vary in their size. And sometimes in the pressure control mode, you can notice a small plateau at the top of the volume time scalar. This is because the flow might have reached the baseline, but the inspiratory time is still being continued. So the tidal volume has been delivered and already when the flow has reached the baseline, but a small plateau is occurring because the cycling has not yet occurred. However, if you have applied inspiratory hold at the end of inspiration in the VCV mode, then also you can see this kind of pattern in VCV mode. Now let's zoom into one complex of the volume time scalar in VCV mode. So from this you can identify the when inspiration begins, when expiration begins, and when the expiration ends. So the volume time scalar should start from the baseline and reach the baseline, and you can calculate the inspiratory tidal volume and expiratory tidal volume separately. Now, what are the different abnormal patterns you can identify? One is air trapping or leak. If you find this kind of picture where the expiratory volume does not reach the baseline, or there is sudden truncation, it suggests that the inspired volume has not come out entirely. So it can be because of certain amount of air trapping, like in patients with COPD, asthma, emphysema, or it can be because of a volume leak, because of maybe some circuit leak or endotracheal tube cuff leak. You can also see that during the expiration phase, the volume takes longer time, exhale volume takes longer time to reach the baseline and come out of the lungs. So it suggests that probably there is either some expiratory resistance because of the bronchospasm, or it can happen because of a blocked expiratory malfunctioning expiratory valve. Now let us come to the pressure support mode. This is one of the common winning modes, and the main difference of pressure support mode from a volume control or pressure control mode is that here almost all the breaths are patient triggered, because patient's own inspiratory effort is augmented by a set pressure support level. So if you look at the pressure time scalar of a PSV mode, you'll realize that all the breaths are patient triggered breath, and the pressure time scalar shows a kind of constant or square wave pattern. So this is a pressure limited ventilation mode. Now the flow is here again the decelerating flow like the pressure control mode, but the basic difference is that the flow does not return to the baseline at the end of inspiration, because the cycling here is flow cycle, and we set a specific percentage of flow at which the cycling will occur. For example, if you set a flow cycle of 25%, which is commonly used, then the flow will terminate and cycling will occur once the flow has reached 25% of its initial peak inspiratory flow. So this mode becomes patient triggered, flow cycle, and pressure limited mode of ventilation. However, in PSV mode, there is always a backup ventilation rate. So if the patient does not breathe for a certain period of time on his own, the ventilator will initiate its own breaths, which will be time cycle. So as I said, the difference of pressure control and pressure support mode is that in PSV almost always it will be patient triggered breaths, whereas in PCV these are usually time triggered, and both are pressure limited, but PCV is time cycle and the flow reaches the baseline, whereas PSV is flow cycle and flow does not reach the baseline. Now, what is the difference between PSV and CPAP? In PSV, you administer a PEEP as well as inspiratory pressure support. In CPAP, you administer a constant positive airway pressure throughout the respiratory cycle. So this is like a spontaneous breathing pattern only. You see sine wave patterns. Only difference is that the sine waves will operate at a higher level than the baseline, and this difference will suggest how much amount of CPAP has been provided in the circuit. Now let us examine closely and interpret the variety of loops. So we have two different types of loops: pressure volume loop and flow volume loop. So the first figure shows you the pressure volume loop. Here the pressure is in the x-axis and volume is in the y-axis. This is a typical picture of pressure volume loop of VCV mode. So here the inspiration begins, and there is rise in the inspiratory pressure till it reaches the peak inspiratory pressure, and the set tidal volume is delivered, and then the expiration starts when the volume comes out and pressure gradually comes and reaches the baseline. So these are the different types of PV loop. In control ventilation, it will be elliptical in nature. If it is an assisted mode or the patient triggered mode, then you will see a small negative deflection in the beginning of the PV loop. Whereas a patient who breathes spontaneously, you will see the inspiratory part is on the negative side of the PV loop. Now let us examine closely how the PV loop will vary with change in the compliance. The central green waveform suggests the normal PV loop. Here the compliance is derived basically from the slope of this PV loop. So compliance basically is change in the volume with change in the pressure, delta V divided by delta P. The unit is ml per centimeter of H2O. So the slope of this PV loop will suggest you how is the compliance. What happens when compliance decreases? Like for example, in a patient with ARDS, then you will need a higher amount of pressure to deliver the tidal volume. So the PV loop will shift to the right. The peak inspiratory pressure will require a higher amount of peak inspiratory pressure to deliver the same amount of tidal volume. Whereas the opposite will happen in a case of say for example emphysema, where compliance is good or high. So you will require less peak inspiratory pressure to deliver the preset tidal volume. So the PV loop will shift to the left as shown by the yellow waveform here. What happens in PCV mode? In PCV mode here, the green loop is the normal loop. When the compliance reduces, like in ARDS, uh, with the preset peak inspiratory pressure, the delivered tidal volume will go down. So the PV loop will descend downwards. Whereas in case of a good compliance or high compliance, the PV loop will shift upwards. If you observe closely, there is subtle difference in the PV loop characteristics of VCV mode versus the PCV mode. As you are aware, in the PCV mode, the pressure rises fast in the beginning of inspiration and reaches the peak inspiratory pressure. Then throughout the inspiration, it is maintained at that level. So if you look at the PV loop or the PCV mode on the right hand side picture of your screen, this will look the same. Initial rise in the pressure and then the pressure is maintained constantly. This will give the PV loop an appearance of square wave in comparison to the elliptical nature of the PV loop in VCV mode. Now next, it is important for us to understand the inflection points. uh, the If you observe closely, the slope of this PV loop tells you how the compliance is. If you follow the inspiratory limb of the PV loop, there will be a point where there is change in the slope angulation of the PV loop. So initially the pressure rises higher, but delivered tidal volume is less, and beyond a certain point the rise in pressure is less, but the delivered tidal volume is high. So this point suggests lower inflection point, which means essentially the point of alveolar opening. So we presume that at this point the alveoli open up, and beyond that the compliance improves and we require less amount of pressure further to deliver the subsequent part of the tidal volume. Whereas in the expiratory phase, beyond this point, which is known as upper inflection point, the alveoli start closing and the volume starts coming down faster, and the change in the pressure subsequently is less. Initially the change in the pressure was more. So the importance of understanding the upper and the lower inflection point is that between these 2 points the alveoli are supposed to be open. So when you are judging how much PEEP you should administer in a patient, if you administer PEEP between these upper and lower inflection points, theoretically you should have majority of the alveoli open during both the phases of respiration. Now sometimes you can see this kind of picture, which is called beaking in the PV loop. The beaking suggests that the alveolar over distended. Beyond this point, further increase in the peak airway pressure will not deliver any more tidal volume, and we should immediately reduce the delivered tidal volume or reduce the set peak inspiratory pressure in the ventilation to avoid ventilator induced lung injury. Now, many times you will understand that the PV loop has increased in size and width, although the slope remains fixed. So, if you find that the inspiratory part of the PV loop has increased in width, it suggests that more and more inspiratory resistance is there. It can be because of endotracheal tube size is too small or kinked, or patient is biting the tube. Similarly, if you find the expiratory part of the PV loop has increase in width, then it may be because of increase in the expiratory resistance. For example, maybe because of secretions or bronchospasm. Now let us come to the flow volume loops. Now this figure shows a typical flow volume loop of a spontaneously breathing patient. Here the volume is plotted in the x-axis and flow is plotted in the y-axis. So from this you can calculate the tidal volume, the vital capacity, the peak expiratory flow, and forced expiratory flows at 25%, 50% and 75% of the tidal breath. Now we need to identify the various abnormalities in the flow volume loop. For example, this figure shows an increase in the expiratory airway resistance in the grossly. If you look at this picture, you will realize how the flow volume loop varies in an obstructive lung disease versus in a restrictive lung disease. The green dotted loop in the center suggests how it looks in a normal patient. In a restrictive lung disease, the lung volumes are low, so the size of the flow volume loop will be smaller, whereas the shape tends to remain similar. In obstructive lung disease, the obstruction in COPD patients is predominantly expiratory obstruction. So we'll identify that the expiratory part of the flow volume loop is truncated, and you can see a scooped out pattern in the expiratory limb of the flow volume loop. It will be clear in subsequent. Now have a look at this various types of flow volume loop. In figure A, you can find a normal flow volume loop of a person with normal lung. Now in the figure B, the inspiratory part remains normal, whereas the expiratory part, you see the peak expiratory flow is less, and there is a scooping pattern observed in the expiratory part, which suggests that there is increase in the expiratory resistance. So this is a typical picture of a COPD emphysema patient. Now what happens, you have a fixed upper airway obstruction, for example a growth in the vocal cord in a CL larynx. The lungs are normal, but the fixed obstruction will obstruct the flow in both inspiration as well as in expiration. So in the figure D, the inspiratory and expiratory part of the flow volume loop both have been truncated, whereas the width of the flow volume loop is same as the normal lung, because the lung volumes are normal in this case. What happens if you have a variable obstruction? Look at the picture in the figure of E. Here we presume that the patient is having a variable extrathoracic obstruction. For example, a patient with colloid goiter. In an extrathoracic obstruction, the inspiratory flow will be reduced because of the negative inspiratory pressure and the pressure of the mass during the phase of inspiration. So the inspiratory part of the flow volume loop is truncated, whereas the expiratory part is not affected at all. The opposite will happen in case you have a variable intrathoracic obstruction, for example a mediastinal mass. During inspiration phase, due to the negative intrathoracic pressure, the trachea and bronchi will remain patent, whereas during the expiration phase, the positive intrathoracic pressure in combination with the mediastinal mass will compress the trachea and bronchi, and you have an obstruction in the expiratory phase of the flow. So a variable extrathoracic obstruction will have inspiratory flow truncation, whereas a variable intrathoracic obstruction will have an expiratory flow truncation. Now what happens in restrictive lung disease? The shape of the flow volume loop remains normal, but the size is reduced significantly, like you see in the figure G in the bottom left side. If you have unilateral lung collapse, or say in a post pneumonectomy patient, you will see the similar pattern because effective lung volume is reduced. In a patient with profound neuromuscular weakness, again it is a pattern of restrictive lung disease. So the flow volume loop characteristics will be similar to restrictive lung disease, but it will be more like a globular small shaped loop. This is because the patients, due to the patient's inadequate muscular effort, the inspiratory and expiratory change in the shape of this waveform cannot be achieved by the patient because of lack of proper muscular efforts. Now, the flow volume loop looks differently in a patient who is on positive pressure ventilation. Here, the inspiration will be above the x-axis and expiration will be below the x-axis. So, by looking at the flow volume loop, here again you can identify the tidal volume delivered, the peak inspiratory flow, and the peak expiratory flow. Now, do they look different in a VCV mode versus a PCV mode? Yes. So, if you remember the flow characteristics of VCV mode, it is a constant or the square wave flow pattern. So, this will be reflected in the flow volume loop as well. The inspiratory part of the flow volume loop will be having a plateau in the top of it. Whereas in the PCV mode, the flow is a decelerating flow pattern, which will be evident from the look of the flow volume loop in a patient who is on PCV mode. Now, various abnormalities you can identify by just have a look at the flow volume loop. For example, in this picture on the right hand side, this suggests the abnormality you found in a patient with increased airway resistance. Again, here the peak expiratory flow will reduce and there will be scooping out pattern of the expiratory part of the flow volume loop. And you can also appreciate the change in the flow volume loop post bronchodilator therapy. In a patient who is having actively bronchospasm, you can appreciate from the middle figure that the peak expiratory flow has been reduced and the scooping pattern can be noticed in the expiratory part. After administering the bronchodilator therapy, the change can be easily appreciated by the fact that the peak expiratory flow will increase and the scooping pattern has been reduced. You can also identify air trapping or air leak from the look of the flow volume loop as well. For example, in case of a air trapping like in COPD patients with dynamic hyperinflation, the expiratory phase of the flow volume loop will not come to the baseline of the volume axis. So it suggests that some amount of volume is trapped inside the lung. On the other hand, if there is continuous air leak in the form of say bronchopleural fistula or endotracheal tube calf leak, the expiratory phase of the flow volume loop will reach the volume axis and the entire volume which went inside the lung in the inspiration phase will not come out. So from this loop, in fact, you can even calculate the amount of or the volume of air which is leaking outside. So, to summarize, we have three types of scalars: the pressure time, flow time, and the volume time scalar. Among them, the pressure time and flow time scalars will give you the wealth of information. And we have two types of loops: pressure volume loops and flow volume loops. So, we should start observing these scalars and loops in a patient who is on mechanical ventilation and start interpreting the patient ventilator interactions by observing closely all these scalars and loops. And you can use this data to identifying the patient's clinical condition or change in the patient's clinical conditions over a period of time, either the progress or the deterioration. And once you start administering therapy, you can monitor the response to certain therapies also by closely observing the change in these scalars and loops. So hope we'll start using this the ventilator graphics more and more as we start using the patients on mechanical ventilation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Rahul Kumar Anand. I work in the Department of Anesthesiology, Pain Medicine and Critical Care. I'll be discussing about modes of mechanical ventilation and their management. The outline will be basic mechanics of ventilator modes, how to do the setting, how to do the fine tuning, what are the advantages and disadvantages of particular modes, and what are the evidences. I'll be discussing about volume control ventilation, pressure control ventilation, pressure support ventilation, SIMV with pressure support, and APRV. If we talk about the settings of volume control ventilation, we choose flow pattern, and this may be constant or it may be decelerating or maybe accelerating. In few ventilators it is by default constant, and in few you can choose it. Flow rate may be increase or decrease in few ventilators, whereas in other form of ventilator we can increase or decrease it by changing inspirator. FiO2 is usually set 100% at the time of intubation, then we can decrease it as per the SpO2 of the patient. Inspiratory trigger is around 2, whether it is pressure or whether it is flow, we keep it around 2. If you talk about the tidal volume, it depends upon the predictive body weight of the patient and compliance of the patient, or compliance of the lung more appropriately. If the compliance, usually the compliance is around 40 to 50 in a intubated adult. If the compliance is good, maybe 50, then we can give tidal volume around 8, maybe 9. If the compliance is poor, we start from 6 ml per kg. Then we choose respiratory rate to achieve a desired minute ventilation. I to E ratio is kept on the basis of respiratory time constant, and respiratory time constant is the product of resistance and compliance. We have to keep the expiratory time minimum 3 times of the respiratory time constant. In few ventilators we can choose T-pause. The T-pause, what happens that we keep a setting around 10 to 20% of the inspiratory time. So once the inspiratory time is over, then the machines will stop flow, and it will decrease the flow around 20 to 30% of the inspiratory time. Pressure will fall from peak inspiratory pressure to plateau pressure, and there will be increase in the mean airway pressures, and that leads to better oxygenation. We keep it around 20% in ARDS patients, and in COPD patient we should not keep it. In COPD patient, if you are keeping it, it will increase the inspiratory time, and that too on the cost of the expiratory time. Therefore, it is recommended not to use it in COPD patient. If you talk about the PEEP, then we can choose the PEEP depending upon the compliance of the lung. If the compliance is poor, then we can go for high PEEP more than 10. If the compliance is good, then we must stick to less than 10 PEEP. We can choose PEEP according to the ARDS network table, or we can choose it on the basis of lower inflection point of pressure volume curve, or we can derive it by using compliance optimization technique. In this technique, what we do is we set a particular PEEP, see the compliance, then again increase it to know about the best compliance, and we keep the PEEP where there is best compliance. Or we can also use driving pressure. In the driving pressure, it is the subtraction of plateau pressure from PEEP. We have to keep it less than 14. We can also see stress index. To see stress index, patient should be on the constant flow, volume control ventilation. Then the pressure time we see it. This is the flat part. It should be like this in normal, which suggests that stress index is 1. If it is over distending, means the concavity is upwards, then the stress index is more than 1, and it suggests that we have to decrease the PEEP. And if the concavity is towards the downside, that means the stress index is less than 1, we can increase the PEEP if it is like that. Or we can use an expiratory transpulmonary pressure to assess the PEEP. It is kept around 0 to 2. Or we can use CT scan, electrical impedance tomography, to set the PEEP. Then there is another section which is known as alarms. We have to keep the alarms as per the requirement of the patient. By default, the alarms are in between 20 to 2000 ml. So the range is very high. We have to set the alarms as per the requirement of the patients. In the advantages of volume controlled ventilation, it is associated with decrease in the work of breathing, and minute ventilation is quite predictable. Whereas if we talk about the disadvantage, the problem is with the change in the compliance, there will be change in the plateau pressure, and that may lead to ventilator-induced lung injuries. So one has to be very much there. Actually, in all patients, in all mechanical ventilated patients, the things are dynamic. We must do a setting and see the patient within few hours of within 1 or 2 hours of doing that setting. Coming to the fine tuning of the volume control ventilation. Now you see here there is difference in this pressure time scaler and this pressure time scaler. What happens when there is increased respiratory demand and machine is not able to provide that demand or that flow properly, then there will be some concavity, upward concavity in the pressure time scaler. This suggests flow asynchrony. That means the flow, the inspiratory flow you are giving is not appropriate, and you have to adjust it by increasing the flow, or you have to see why the flow supply demand mismatch is there. Is it because patient is coughing on the tube, patient is in pain, hyper, why it is there? Then you have to treat according. If we give less amount of the time during inspiration or less amount of support during inspiration, it will lead to a asynchrony, which is known as double triggering. It is especially very true in ARDS patient. What happens in when we give less amount of the tidal volume, then the neural inspiratory time is more and the ventilatory inspiratory time is less. That leads to asynchrony. Patient will try to breathe more. Machine will try to exhale and patient will try to breathe. That will leads to breath stacking. High amount of tidal volume, as we can see here, this is breath stacking. The tidal volume is very high and this leads to ventilator induced lung injury. And why this tidal volume is high? It is because patient is not able to exhale. Without proper exhalation, the second breath is started. The treatment is we should increase the support. Increase the support means if patient is on volume control ventilation, we should increase the tidal volume. If the patient is on pressure control ventilation, we have to increase the P inspired. Okay, that's how we can take care of. Coming to pressure control ventilation, it may be patient or machine triggered, limited by pressure, and it is cycled by. In the settings of pressure control ventilation, we start from high FiO2, 100% FiO2, and we decrease it as per the requirement of the patient as per the SpO2 or as per PaO2. In the triggering, we can choose flow trigger or volume trigger. We keep it around 2. In the inspiratory pressure, this inspiratory pressure is about above PEEP. So we keep it so that adequate amount of tidal volume can be generated. And in the, if you talk about I to E ratio, the I to E ratios should be such that there should be some proper deceleration of the inspiratory flow rate, and then expiration should start. We should not abolish the inspiration or abolish the flow in between to start the expiration. That will decrease the tidal volume. We can keep the PEEP as per the requirement of the patient. We discussed it. Coming to rise time. Rise time is the time taken from baseline to reach the peak inspiratory pressures. This is known as the rise time. Tidal volume also depends upon the rise time. Again, then we have to keep the alarms as per the patient, body weight of the patient, as per the. There are many factors which influence tidal volume in a patient who is on pressure control ventilation. They are resistance and compliance and inspiratory pressure. Say if the resistance and compliance are not favorable, then for a fixed amount of inspiratory pressure, tidal volume will be low. If the resistance and compliance are favorable, the tidal volume will be relatively okay. Tidal volume also depends upon inspiratory to expiratory time. Ideally, we should allow the peak inspiratory flow rate to reach the baseline and then expiration should start. If we abolish the peak inspiratory flow rate or the flow rate midway and start the expiration, less time will be available for inspiration. Therefore, the tidal volume will be smaller. There are few advantages of pressure control ventilation, like decrease in the work of breathing, less peak airway pressures, whereas there are certain disadvantages like minute ventilation is not certain and tidal volume may increase or decrease as per the resistance of the compliance. Coming to the fine tuning of pressure control ventilation, again double triggering may be there. So if there is any double triggering, then what we have to do, we have to increase the inspiratory pressure. We have to give more support or more time during inspiration. If you talk about the superiority of PCV versus VCV or PCV on VCV or VCV on PCV, as per Cochrane review, there is no superiority of VCV on PCV. As such, it is not about the modes, it is about the person who is using these mechanical ventilator. Coming to pressure support ventilation, it is one of the most used mode of weaning. As such, it seems to be very simple, but believe me, it is very difficult because the setting needs frequent attention. It is patient trigger, limited by pressure, and cycled by flow. The difference between pressure support ventilation and pressure control ventilation is cycling. In the pressure control ventilation, it is time cycle. In pressure support, cycled. If you talk about the settings, we have to keep some inspiratory trigger. As we all know, we can keep it around 2. Then is the rise time. For the rise time, now we all know that this angle should be around 80 to 90 degree. And then is the pressure support. We keep pressure support to deliver a particular tidal volume, and there are also certain concerns about the pressure support. Our target is to give optimal pressure support levels. If we are giving less or insufficient assistance, then it will lead to tachypnea, discomfort, and hypercapnia. That will lead to respiratory muscle workload. If we increase or if we give excessive assistance, it will lead to increase hyperinflation, increase in the inspiratory PEEP, ineffective breathing, discomfort, and also diaphragmatic dysfunction. PEEP, we all know. As such, we use pressure support ventilation for weaning when the minute ventilation is less than 10 liters, and at that time the requirement of PEEP is not really very high. It is usually less than 10. We can set the PEEP as per the requirement of the patient at that time. Here, there is one thing which is very important, is expiratory trigger. In pressure control ventilation, cycle cycling is by time. Here it is by flow. What happens? This is the during inspiration, this is the peak inspiratory flow rate, and over the period of time it will decay down, and the percentage of peak inspiratory flow rate at which the expiration will start is set by the clinician, and it is known as expiratory trigger. By default, it is around 25%. We can choose it depending upon the condition of the patient. I'll be discussing about it. Then backup settings or apnea criteria. The first and foremost requirement for pressure support ventilation is preserved ventilatory drive of the patient. If patient is not able to trigger the ventilator, then we have to keep some backup settings to avoid decrease in the minute ventilation. So we consider some apnea time around 10 to 30 seconds depending upon the condition of the patient, and then we choose some tidal volume, some respiratory rate, so that a minimum amount of minute ventilation may reach the patient. Coming to factors affecting tidal volume. Patient's effort, they affect tidal volume. If the efforts are more, patient is generating more negative pressure, more tidal volume will be created. It also depends upon resistance and compliance of the lung. Say we are giving pressure support of 10 and the compliance is good, more tidal volume will be delivered. If the compliance is less, less tidal volume will be delivered. And if the resistance is more, what will happen? Then the less amount of tidal volume will be delivered at a particular setting of pressure support. If we increase the pressure support in a patient who is having normal resistance and normal compliance, tidal volume will increase. Then is the expiratory trigger. Expiratory trigger tells us about the inspiratory time. If we keep the expiratory trigger towards the lower side, maybe 10, that means once the peak inspiratory flow rate reaches to 10% of its original, then expiration will start. That means more time will be available for inspiration, and if more time is available, more tidal volume will be there. Coming to the fine-tuning of pressure support ventilation. Let's assume there are two sets of patient. One is the patient with increased resistance like COPD patient. The another one is subset with decreased compliance like obesity, scoliosis, or a patient who is recovering from ARDS. In a patient with increased resistance, we want to give less time in inspiration and more time during expiration, because we all know that expiration is the product of it. Expiratory time depends upon respiratory time constant, and this respiratory time constant depends upon resistance and compliance. If we are having a patient whose resistance is more, that means patient will spend more time during exhaling out the gases. So what we should do is we should keep the expiratory trigger towards the higher side. Higher side means if this is the peak inspiratory flow rate, then we have to keep it around 50% of the peak inspiratory flow rate, or 60 or 70 depending upon the condition of the patient. Now you see, if we allow it to decay down to 25%, then it will give more time to inspiration. Normally we keep it as 25 because it's a default setting. In patient of COPD, we have to keep it around 50 to 70. In coming to a patient with the decreased compliance, we should allow it to decay down completely, because we know in a patient with decreased compliance there is decreased respiratory time constant, and that's why they need less time. In the fine tuning, this is another form of problem which we routinely see in patient on pressure support ventilation. Now you see here there is a small notch in the end of the inspiration. It is because ventilator is giving support, or ventilator is giving inspiration while patient wants to exhale. Therefore, the trouble is there. The treatment is decrease the pressure support or give less time for inspiration. Coming to another form of asynchrony which is quite prevalent in maybe any kind of ventilation, but more in pressure support ventilation, it is ineffective triggering. Means patient is trying to breathe, but patient is not able to trigger the ventilator. So the effective triggering is not there. What happens with this is the efforts will be wasted and it leads to increase in the work of breathing. There are many causes of it, like low respiratory drive, low PaCO2. If you are giving too much of the assistance, that is leading to low PaCO2 and relaxation of the diaphragm. If you are over sedating a patient, all these things may lead to ineffective triggering. Now you can see here in this patient, though total respiratory rate is 22, we can see these are the efforts which are not taken care of. Ventilator is not able to, patient is not able to trigger the ventilator here. So the overall overall respiratory rate is high, but machine is not counting these small efforts. That's why it is 22. So what has been done is the pressure support is decreased. Now you see here the pressure support is somewhere around 16, 17. Here the pressure support is around 12, and you see here there is relatively less ineffective triggering. Okay, but the total respiratory rate is high because every respiration is now taken care of and there is less ineffective triggering. Here you can see again there is no ineffective triggering. So if you are giving too much of the assistance, this is an example here. If you are giving too much of the assistance, it can lead to ineffective triggering. There are few advantages of pressure support ventilation, like it decreases work of breathing, it is very good for weaning, it leads to preservation of respiratory muscles, and it is associated with less patient ventilator asynchronous. There are certain disadvantages, like it requires patient's respiratory drive to work, and the minute ventilation is less certain. Respiratory drive. Coming to SIMV. SIMV as such may be volume control ventilation SIMV or pressure control SIMV. It needs to have some intermittent mandatory ventilation. What happens is we set some respiratory rate, and that much amount of respiration is given by the ventilator. But there is a trick here. those respiration will be synchronized. Means that there will be some synchronization window. As such, this synchronization window is different in different ventilators. It is around 0.5 in this graphic. That means if we set the respiratory rate around 10, then for each cycle patient is getting 6 seconds, or you can say that after every 6 seconds patient is getting one inspiration. So within zero point 0.5 seconds of that 6 second, that means from 5.5 second to 6 second, if a patient is trying to breathe, then the machine will synchronize with that respiration. This is known as SIMV, or synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation. But the problem with this is, or the beauty of this mode is, that patient can breathe in between the breaths on his own or on her own. Patient has to breathe against the demand valve. That leads to increase in the increase in the work of breathing. So to overcome this thing, what people have done, they added pressure support to augment the respiration so that there is less chances of increase work of breathing. In the setting, we keep the setting same as that of VCV or PCV or pressure support ventilation. Basically, it's the combination of PCV with pressure support or VCV with pressure support. Those settings are coming to SIMV with pressure support. Advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are it maintains respiratory muscle strength, avoid muscle atrophy, reduce ventilation to perfusion mismatch, and decrease mean airway pressure. But it is also associated with certain disadvantages like patient ventilator asynchronous. What happens to a patient when patient is on SIMV with pressure support is, say we set a pressure support of 10 and a respiratory rate of 10 with I ratio of 1:2. So patient will spend some 2 seconds for inspiration and some X amount of time during inspiration when the patient is on pressure support. So the neural inspiratory time will keep on changing from A to B, from A to B, like that, and that leads to a confusion. So patient is breathing for some neural inspiratory time when patient is on pressure support, for some other time when patient is on IMV, and that leads to ventilator asynchronous. Coming to APRV, this mode is having a high flow CPAP basically with a release valve. So there will be very high CPAP, then pressure will release, come to baseline, again pressure will jump to high pressures. This is the pressure volume graph, and it suggests that to a particular zone, if we keep the tidal volume or pressure towards the lower side, that will lead to atelectasis. This is zone of atelectotrauma. If we stretch too much, or if we give too much of the volume, too much of the pressures, it will lead to another form of injury. So in APRV, we try to work in this zone where there are chances of less atelectotrauma or chances of less volume. APRV as such, the triggering may be because of patient or because of machine. It is pressure limited and times. In the settings, we keep FiO2 as per the requirement of the patient and P high depending upon the requirement of the patient. Again, if the patient, we are switching a patient from VCV to APRV, then the plateau pressure will be P high, and if we are switching a patient from PCV to P high APRV, then the P high will be the peak pressure of pressure controlled ventilation. P low will be 0. T high usually is kept around 4 to 5 seconds or maybe 6 seconds. Usually it is 5 to 6 seconds. T low depends upon the time constant. So what we do is we multiply resistances to compliance and we keep T low equal to 1 respiratory time constant. The beauty of APRV is that patient can breathe during the high pressures or the low pressure area. So patient can breathe in this and this zone, and that leads to increase in the work of breathing in some patients. So in few ventilator there is facility of pressure augmentation, or patient can trigger the ventilator, machine can support. This is pressure augmentation on APRV. To wean a patient, the methodology is drop and stretch. What we do is we decrease the inspiratory pressure and we stretch the inspiratory time from 5 or 6. We keep the inspiratory 5 or 6 seconds. The inspiratory time is stretched to 10 or 12 seconds. And for pressure support, pressure control or the inspiratory pressure, they are decreased from maybe 25 or 28 to 20 less than 15. And once the P high is 15 or 16 and the T high is around 10 seconds, we can switch the patient from APRV to. There are certain advantages of APRV. It is associated with very good alveolar recruitment and improved oxygenation. Preservation of spontaneous breathing is there. That means less sedation is required. Basically, it leads to reduction of left ventricle transmural pressure. That means decrease in the left ventricle afterload. It is potentially lung protective because it's work in the zone in between atelectotrauma and volutrauma, and it gives better ventilation independent areas. There are certain disadvantages, like it is associated with increased risk of volutrauma from increased uh, transpulmonary pressures. There is increase in the work of breathing because of spontaneous breathing, and that's why in some APRV mode there is pressure augmentation or pressure support. There may be worsening of air leaks. Increased right ventricular afterload is there because patient is breathing at very high pressures, and that leads to increase in the pulmonary artery pressures. There is reduction in the right ventricular venous return because of that. Also, there are chances of dynamic hyperinflation. If you talk about the evidences, then few studies suggest that it is associated with favorable outcome in the term of oxygenation. One study suggests that it is associated with less amount of days spent on ventilator in cases of ARDS. Concrete evidences in favor of APRV are not there that it should be the preferred mode of ventilation. It is not like that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, after discussing modes of ventilation, now we'll discuss the weaning from mechanical ventilation. So, myself is Dr. Vikas Rai, and we'll discuss this weaning from ventilation under the following headings. First, we'll discuss how to assess whether the patient is ready for weaning or not. We'll then try to understand the various methods of weaning, how to approach a patient who is difficult to wean, how to take a decision when to extubate, and post-extubation care. Also, in the end, we'll discuss weaning from non-invasive ventilation and high-flow nasal cannula. These are the normal stages of mechanical ventilation that has been described by Tobin, and weaning is a part of one on this stage. Weaning is defined as the process of liberating the patient from mechanical ventilation and umbilical tube. It is basically decreasing the support from the from the ventilator so that the patient can take control of his or her own ventilation. Liberation from the mechanical ventilation is a more appropriate term and is nowadays frequently used instead of weaning. Why weaning? Because it decreases morbidity, the lesser chance of ventilation associated lung injury, lesser chance of VAP, venous thromboembolism, and GI bleed. Also, it decreases mortality and reduces resource utilization. It has been found that all the patients who are on mechanical ventilation, around 41% of their time are spent on weaning, and it costs for about 30% of the ICU researchers. Liberation from mechanical ventilation involves discontinuation from mechanical ventilation and extubation. Again, discontinuation from mechanical ventilation involves two steps. First step is readiness testing, second test is weaning. Readiness testing for weaning involves some clinical criteria which are most frequently used. However, certain physicians in uncertain circumstances needed some physiological test which is known as weaning predictors. Also, there are integrated indices to find out whether the patient is ready for weaning or not. These are the clinical criteria which is most commonly used for readiness testing, and most important among these is the cause for respiratory failure for which the patient was intubated is improved or resolved or not. Apart from that, PF ratios more than 150, saturation more than 90% with FiO2 less than 40%, and a PPuff less than equal to 5 cm water, pH more than 7.25, hemodynamical stability, no or minimal vasopressor support like noradrenaline 5 mics per kg per minute, or able to initiate an inspiratory effort, hemoglobin more than 8%, core temperature less than 30°, mental status that the patient should be awake, alert, and easily arrangeable are the criteria which has to be taken into consideration. Apart from this, optimized fluid status is also important because it leads to failure of weaning. These are the weaning predictors, which are mostly based on some physiological parameters like oxygenation or gas exchange, low measurement of load on the respiratory system, measurement of the respiratory muscle capacities. Found that none of these weaning predictors are found to be superior or superior to the objective clinical criteria in predicting patients' readiness to wean. Among these, P.1 is the most effective one with higher sensitivity specificity with area under the curve around 0.9. It is basically the inspiratory drop of airway pressure at 100 milliseconds after airway occlusion. Previously, it used to be calculated with a separated apparatus, but now the modern ventilator has inbuilt mode to find out the P.1. It indicates central respiratory activity, and normal values is less than 2 centimeter of water. And P.1 less than 4 centimeter water predicts successful weaning. It has been found that the ratio of P.1 and MIP, that is the maximum inspiratory pressure, is a better indicator for find out readiness of weaning. Integrated index, rapid shallow breathing index, inspiratory effort quotient, crop index, core index, weaning index, and integrative weaning index are there to find out the readiness of weaning or readiness testing for weaning. However, these are complex calculations, and in certain scenarios, it requires some extra apparatus apart from the ventilator to find out these parameters. Among these, the rapid shallow breathing index, that is known as RSVI, which is most frequently used. It is easy to calculate, as much more reliable. It is the ratio of respiratory rate to that of the tidal volume, which is in liters. It is measured originally with the patient spontaneously breathing on a T-piece with a spirometer, or you can put the patient on a low level of CPAP or breath support ventilation. The cutoff value are around 100 to 105 breaths per minute per liter. Anything more than 105, the chances of failure for readiness of weaning. It has a sensitivity of around 96%, specificity of 68%, and area under the curve around 0.98. It may be different in different scenarios, and the cutoff values for different scenarios are yet to be validated. When to do the readiness testing, it has been suggested that the patients who are mechanically ventilated for more than 24 hours, readiness testing should be done every day, preferably with the daily screening of clinical parameters. Weaning predictors are only used whenever there is a doubt persists despite the ready to wean according to the clinical criteria. Whenever the weaning predictors are used, the RSBI is the preferred one because it is easy and much more reliable. Liberation from mechanical ventilation consists of readiness testing for weaning. Whenever the testing is done, either the patient is ready to wean, in that case the weaning trials are started. If the patient failed readiness testing, then patient is reassessed after 24 hours. Different methods of weaning are the traditional methods are spontaneous breathing trial, progressive decrease in the level of support during process support ventilation, or progressive decrease in the number of ventilator assisted breath during IMV, that is intermittent mandatory ventilation. However, this is less preferred and it has been found to be not a good mode for weaning. Hence, the both modes of spontaneous breathing trials and progressive decrease in support are much frequently used. Newer modes like computer-driven automated process support ventilation and extubation to NIV are also popular. Based weaning method, it has been found that spontaneous breathing trial is simple, efficient, safe, and effective compared to other weaning methods. What is SPT? It is defined. It is basically a challenge to the patient so that the patient can breathe on his or her own. It is referred to the spontaneous breathing of patients through the endotracheal tube for a set period of time, which is normally 30 minutes to 2 hours, either without any ventilator support through a T-piece or with a minimal ventilator support. The minimal ventilator support is described as a low level of pressure support ventilation, that is 5 to 8 centimeter of water, a automated tube compensated mode, or a CPAP mode. The ATC or automated tube compensation mode, basically a mode in the ventilator to find out to adjust for the resistance that is offered by the endotracheal tube. So regarding the best method of SBT, the older study shows that no single SBT method is clearly superior to the other. However, the recent studies show that the SBT with low level of pressure support ventilation is preferred and has many advantages. The main advantage of low level of pressure support ventilation is in terms of whether there is a small endotracheal tube that is less than 7 millimeter internal diameter endotracheal tube are used, so that this can overcome the resistance offered by the tube. Also, during this, the patient is attached to the ventilator, so the ventilatory parameters can be monitored and alarm setting can be adjusted. Disadvantage is that it gives a false reassuring spontaneous breathing trial in cardiogenic pulmonary edema on COPD. Other methods that comparing the TPs with a different mode of weaning has been found to be no difference in terms of reintubation rates or weaning success. Duration, the optimal duration of SBT is unknown. However, it ranges from 30 minutes to 2 hours. It has been suggested that the initial or the fast SBT should be at least 30 minutes. If it is failed, the subsequent SBTs, longer trial or longer duration may be attempted. However, prolonged SBTs or the winning trial is success or failure. This depends upon some subjective criteria and objective criteria. The subjective criteria are mainly agitations, anxiety, decreased mental status, diaphoresis, cyanosis, signs of distress, dyspnea, use of ascending muscles, and the objective criteria is tachypnea, less PO2 less than 60, PaCO2 more than 50 or increase in more than 8 to 10 millimeter by G, hemodynamic changes, tachycardia, hypertension, desaturation, and cardiac arrhythmia. Winning trial, as you know, is after the winning trial, there may be a success in the winning trial or a winning failure. Whenever there is a winning failure, you always sort out what is the cause or etiology of the failure, try to correct that, then proceed with the winning strategy. The common causes of winning failure are basically most common cause is the imbalance between the work of breathing and respiratory muscle capacity, volume overload, cardiac dysfunction, neuromuscular weakness, delirium, anxiety, and metabolic disturbances are other causes for winning failure. Optimal strategy whenever the winning is failed at first attempt is not known. However, SIMV should not be used as a winning mode because it has been found to be inferior to the other modes. Optimal winning strategy involved once daily SBT, which if failed, you should return to the supportive mode and again look for the reversible causes and look for the readiness of winning in the next day. Winning protocols like manual protocols and automated winning protocols are there, but they are not popular and not beneficial in all settings. Winning can be classified as simple winning, difficult winning, and winning. Winning, whenever the first SBT is successful and the patient is extubated, is known as simple winning. If it takes 2 to 3 SBTs or maximum up to 7 days, it is difficult winning. And if it is more than 3 SBTs or more than 7 days, it is known as prolonged winning. As you can see from this different studies, it has been found that prolonged winning has a mortality, ICU mortality from 18 to 42%, which is difficult winning involves identifying the cause, treat the cause, and resume a particular definitive winning strategy. Again, if the winning is successful, then you have to decide for the decision has to be taken for extubation and patient should be extubated. The decision of extubation should be taken after a thorough assessment of the safety of intubation, assessment for the post-extubation stridor, assessment for potential difficulty with reintubation, and assessment for timing of extubation. Assessing safety of intubation is basically to determine whether the patient is medically stable or not, the patient has successfully passed the winning trial, and assess whether the patient can protect his or her airway or not. This is assessed mainly by cough strength, secretions, and level of consciousness, which is the person should be awake, alert, follows command, and preferably off any sedatives. Cough strength is mainly assessed informally by doing deep suctioning at the bedside to assess whether the presence or absence of gag reflex or cough. It can be quantified using a spirometry with peak expiratory flow less than 60 liters per minute, suggesting of high failure rate. Also, index card method can be used. The secretions, although can be measured quantitatively, mostly the frequency of suctioning is taken as a surrogate for amount of secretions, and a requirement of suctioning every 1 to 2 hours is significant and is suggestive of a failed extubation. One of the most that has been found that post-extubation stridor occurs in less than 10% of the patient who is critically ill and intubated. The cause is mainly vocal cord edema or injury or secretions or dysfunctions of the vocal cords or trachea. The risk factors for the post-extubation stridor are many, as like prolonged intubations, low GCS, female gender, history of asthma, excessive large ETT, more age, high Apache score, aspiration, many. However, for assessing the risk of post-extubation stridor, mostly cuff-link tests are used. Newer modality like laryngeal ultrasound or simultaneous use of both cuff and cuff-link can be used. Has been traditionally used to find out the risk for post-extubation stridor. It can be done quantitatively or qualitatively. Qualitatively, normally the cuff is deflected and the endotracheal tube is blocked and the audible leak is checked with a use of stethoscope. For quantitatively, the patient is attached to the ventilator and the volume loss between the inspiratory and expiratory tidal volume is calculated. A cutoff for more than 100 ml is found to be significant. However, this should be with the normal traditional ventilation with higher tidal volume. With the contemporary use of lower tidal volume ventilation, this cutoff may not be accurate. However, a volume loss around more than 20% of tidal volume is better in those settings. As you know, the cuff-link test is cuff-link is present, then the patient is planned for extubation, and if the cuff-link is absent, then the extubation is deferred and other measures like steroids are chosen. However, the absence of a cuff-link alone is an imperfect predictor with a sensitivity of 85% and specificity of 70 to 95%. How to approach a cuff-link test when the patient is ready for extubation? You find out whether the risk factor of laryngeal edema or post-extubation stridor are present or not. If there is no risk factor, do not check for any cuff leak, directly extubate the patient. If the risk factor is present, you go for a cuff leak test, and if leak is present, then you extubate. If there is no leak, you start some short course of steroid as soon as possible, preferably 60 mg of IV methylprednisolone, and after 4 to 6 hours extubate even if the cuff leak is absent. Other regimens of steroids like 40 mg IV bolus or 20 mg IV of methylprednisolone for 4 days are also equally effective. And then all the patients should be observed in the ICU. For assessing potential difficulty for intubation, sedation, difficulty airway scores, obesity, whether the patient has any difficulty during the first intubation, and operator's ability and skill should be taken into consideration. Timing or optimal timing of extubation is unknown, preferably assume the daytime or in the morning. Preparing extubation, always estimate the oxygen requirement by the patients. Always have a target for the post-extubation saturation. Extubate the patient in upright position with removal of the tube during exhalation. After extubation, every patient should be supplemented with oxygen. Post-extubation care. In post-extubation care, these are the risk factors for intubation like a weak cough, frequent suctioning, a positive fluid balance during the 24 hours preceding extubation, pneumonia, age more than 65 years with cardiac and respiratory diseases, reduced or absent cuff leak and delirium. So according to this, if the patient have a low risk of intubation, which is around 80 to 85% of the patients, all the person in the post-op period should be on low flow oxygen only. If there is a high risk of intubation, which accounts for around 15 to 20% of the patients, aggressive monitoring and management with continued medical therapy, oxygenation, and airway clearance should be instituted. All patients should not be extubated to NIV or HFNC. However, in selected patients, these ventilation modes can be used. Patients with established post-extubation respiratory failure, which account around 14% of the patient, a therapy targeted to the suspected etiology of respiratory failure should be started, along with simultaneous trial of high flow nasal cannula, NIV, or both NIV plus high flow nasal cannula should be started. Those patients who are unplanned extubation have a high risk for reintubation within 12 hours, so there should be low threshold for intubation, and the patients who fail due to post-extubation stridor should be reintubated immediately. After a short steroid course, cuff-link test and extubation should be planned preferably over a airway exchange catheter. A second failed trial for extubation should always lead to tracheostomy. Refeeding after extubation have little evidence. However, if the patient's intubation for only short duration, like less than 1 week, the feeding can be started few hours after the extubation. If there is a fairly long period of intubation, it can be waited for. The feeding can be started after 12 to 24 hours. Now coming to weaning for non-invasive ventilation. As per the invasive ventilation, always the readiness for weaning criteria, similar clinical objective criteria should be used to find out whether the patient is ready for weaning or not, followed by one of the few methods of weaning should be selected. Normally there are three types of weaning with non-invasive ventilation. First is stepwise reduction of non-invasive ventilation, which is most commonly used. Here, each day the duration on which the patient is NIV is decreased. The British Thoracic Society suggests a 4-day course, with the first day as much as possible the patient can be on NIV, on the second day for 16 hours, third day for 12 hours, and the fourth day it is discouraged from the ventilation. Other approaches are like stepwise reduction of pressure support, where gradually pressure support is decreased followed by discontinuation, and lastly it may be immediately or sudden withdrawal from the NIV, which has a high failure rate. Most commonly, stepwise reduction of NIV is has found to be better than other methods. Weaning from high flow nasal cannula, again readiness to weaning should be tested, followed by the weaning strategy is like first decrease the FiO2. Once the FiO2 is less than 4.4%, decrease the flow rate by 5 liters per minute till the flow rate is less than 15 liters per minute. Then you stop high flows and initiate standard oxygen therapy. So the take home message is that always assess the daily need for readiness of weaning when the patient is intubated. SVT is a preferred mode of ventilation, and low level of pressure support ventilation is a preferred mode of SVT. Always avoid SIMV as a weaning mode. Decision to extubation is crucial and should be assessed properly before extubation. Always plan and prepare for post-extubation care, and follow a stepwise approach when weaning from a non-invasive ventilation or high flow nasal cannula. Thank you. Now we'll take some questions.
We have few questions in our live chat options during the webinar. We'll discuss as many of them as possible. So there was an important question in the ventilator graphics section, that what sorts of precautions should we take to avoid barotrauma or volotrauma when we apply inspiratory hold or expiratory hold maneuver. So I'd like to come to Dr. Rahul for the answer.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dalia. For inspiratory pause, actually different ventilators have different settings. In few ventilators, the duration is from 0.5 to 5 seconds. You have to choose it. Better you hold it for a shorter period of time, maybe 0.5 seconds or less than 2 seconds. The other thing is, you are stopping the ventilation and patient wants to breathe. That's why patient is coughing, and that's why there is sudden shooting in the alarms, or the peak airway pressures that goes high. So if you are doing inspiratory pause, patient should be sedated, not too high, but there should be some level of the sedation. The patient should be comfortable on the tube, should not be coughing on the tube. For expiratory pause, it should be around 2 seconds. The other thing is, everybody in the world, that person or that any creature that wants to breathe, same is with any person who is on endotracheal intubation. If we don't allow the person to breathe, he'll try to breathe against that. It happens with expiratory pause. So for expiratory pause, the level of the sedation should be very high. That's why it is not recommended to give it give frequent expiratory pause in COPD patients.
Right. So there was a question on air trapping also. Someone asked to elaborate on what is air trapping basically. So air trapping is seen mainly in COPD patients when they are admitted with acute exacerbations. What happens if you look at patients of COPD or emphysema, their chest X-ray also, it will look hyperinflated. Their diaphragms are flattened, their lung fields are wide and quite high. So what happens is that because of expiratory resistance, some amount of air gets trapped inside the lungs and it doesn't fully come out. So because of this accumulated airs, the pressures go high, and what we call is that intrinsic PEEP goes high. So by application of expiratory hold maneuver, you can identify, as I had shown in the pressure time scalars, that you can identify the how much amount of intrinsic PEEP the patient is generating. And from a distance, by just looking at the flow time scalar, looking at the expiratory part of the flow time scalar, you can identify if there is air trapping is occurring or not. Next, there was a question on the ideal mode, which ventilation mode should we ideally be using during proning. So many of these patients may require proning, and which mode, like VCV or PCV, which should we choose, Dr. Vikas?
Actually, for proning, the concept is that the patient should not breathe. So most of the time, the patient should be deeply sedated or paralyzed. And though in those conditions, any assist control mode, maybe volume control mode or a pressure control mode can be used. If the patient is paralyzed or deeply sedated, the main aim is that the patient should not breathe on his or her, on herself, not her. So only assist control mode is better with the proning.
Okay. And there was a concern about SIMB mode also. There is a question whether SIMB should be used, whether it's a good mode or not. So what is your message on that?
Regarding SIMB is one of the oldest mode, but it has a very limited role, or at least it is harmful when used in setup of weaning, because it has been found to increase the work of breathing, it has been found to increase dysynchrony, and it has been found to increase the duration of ventilation whenever SIMB used as a weaning mode. For the main reason is that the SIMB, we have some supported breaths and some unsupported breaths. The supported breaths are supposed to give some rest to the respiratory muscles. However, the neuromuscular bundle and neuromuscular units do not cope certainly to changing the load. That is why whether the supported or unsupported, the load of the neuromuscular bundle and hence the muscle are the same. So it leads to fatigue and increased longer duration of ventilation. So it should not be used as a weaning mode. Regarding whether it should be abolished or it should be stay, it is the longest mode, and most of the data or most of the knowledge that we have on ventilation we have from this mode. However, currently the utility of this intermittent ventilation is very low. Maybe in future it may be abolished, but it at least give you a security that some ventilation will go. So in areas where there is a low patient to physician or nurses or sisters ratio, or the monitoring level is low, it can be used for a temporary measure. But the current evidence does not support its use at any of the whether during a maintenance ventilation or a weaning ventilation.
Right. So next, I would like to come to Dr. Rahul. There was an important question that what adjustments we should make while ventilating a pregnant patient.
Okay, for a pregnant patient, the physiology is different. Pregnant ladies, they have respiratory alkalosis, and they cannot tolerate hypercapnia because of fetal acidemia. Hypercapnia is not a good thing. The other thing is they require high amount of or higher side of PaO2 because it's the question of 2 lives. The other thing is their belly, in the belly, fetus is there. So you can, there is some pressure on the lungs. That's why you should or patient can tolerate plateau pressure up to 30, maybe 33, 34, depending upon the condition of the patient or stage of the pregnancy. We should not allow PaCO2 to jump more than 40 or 42. Physiologically, they have PaCO2 of around 34. So if you are if you allow permissive hypercapnia, it is very detrimental for the fetus. PO2 should be more than 70 or 80 mmHg. The standard that 60 to 65 that will not work in pregnant ladies.
Right.
The other question was on the chat, how to do the expiratory pause. Actually, there is a small button knob in the ventilator, and what you have to do, just press it over the period of 1 to 2 seconds, and it will give you the value.
Okay. So next, there are a few questions specifically for COVID patients. So one was that how ventilation strategy might differ in COVID population who are on mechanical ventilation. Now, based on the limited literature which have recently come up, it has been found that there are probably two distinct types of phenotypes in COVID patients who are on mechanical ventilation. They have been termed as type L and type H. So the type L is basically refers to the patients who have lower elastance. They will have good compliance, so the lung recruitability is less, but their lung weight is also less. So basically you identify this group of patients by seeing that their compliance is not a big issue. Compliance is relatively good. So the main defect is VQ mismatch because of predominantly regional perfusion defects. Whereas in type H they will have high elastance, so compliance will be poor, and their recruitability may vary as well. And if you do a CT scan, you will find that these H types do have high lung weight as well. So they will behave more like a typical ARDS kind of patients. So in the beginning phase, it's important to identify whether your patient is having good recruitability or not. So depending on that, you can choose a ventilation strategy in a particular way. So type H will require more of ventilation strategy in the line of ARDS, whereas in type L, the tidal volume may be a little more, and there may be certain role of inhaled nitric oxide which are coming up in the literature. However, having said that, these phenotypes are not mutually exclusive, and they can actually evolve from one to another. Now, there was a question on role of high flow nasal cannula or NIV in COVID patients. So, Dr. Vikas, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, actually, there is a lot of concerns regarding use of non-invasive ventilation currently in COVID patients. The main issue is the generation of aerosols. So, if you come to non-invasive ventilation, mainly it may be a high flow nasal cannula or a non-invasive ventilation with a face mask, and the third option is a helmet. So, as per the current guidelines from different societies, there are some conflicting measures. Some people advocate to use it, some people don't advocate to use this in COVID patients. However, it has been publicized or advertised that if you are using a non-invasive ventilation, whether high flow nasal cannula or any type of face mask or helmet, it should be ideally used inside a room which has a negative pressure with at least 10 to 12 cycles per hour of cycling. But these things in many centers, including in our country, are hard to find because negative pressure rooms are very low. So, but now there are different point of view coming in from different sections of the world, mainly where there is a heavy load of COVID, like from Italy and New York. So the thing is that the mortality whenever the patient is intubated is very high, in up to 80% in New York, and most of the patients are going with a hypoxemia, because it's like the patient will be talking and very happy, or everything will be normal, and within hours he or she will be very hypoxemic. So there is mostly knee-jerk reaction to intubate the patient and put on the ventilator. That is not only putting extra load on the healthcare provider because you have to manage a patient on ventilator, also the scarcity of these ventilators. So they have been suggesting that if you can use this high flow nasal cannula or these non-invasive ventilation in a scenario where all the patients in a room or in a ward or in a ICU, if they are positive, you can use it. And mainly in younger patients which might be reporting with this support for a shorter duration time, maybe 1 or 2 days, and you can definitely get rid of intubation and ventilation, mechanical ventilation that has its own problem. So that is one point of view. Another point of view is that if you are trying to use this to choose between the helmet, face mask, and this high flow nasal cannula, there is very little data with helmet. But with whatever studies you have in simulated models, helmet has a very less aerosol generating capacity. So if you have a helmet, you definitely can use it. But rather, if you don't have a helmet, you don't waste your resources to buy the helmet. You can go with a non-invasive ventilation with normal mask or high flow nasal cannula. The Society of Critical Care Guidelines, the Society of Surviving Sepsis Guidelines, they recommend high flow nasal cannula over NIV because the aerosol generating property with this high flow nasal cannula is less than that of the face mask. So it is in the current point of view of that, you should not strictly adhere to the negative pressure room to use this hyponatremia cannula. If you have a large patient load, so you can definitely go with non-invasive ventilation, but in a much more secure way, in a where all the patients will be COVID positive, so that the transmission will be less. Also, there is a concern regarding the flow rate. If you have a lesser flow rate, maybe less than 40 liters per minute, the distance or the aerosol generator will not travel a lot of distance, so that will again restrict the spread of the transmission.
Yeah, but one more thing we should remember that the patients in whom they are really hypoxic and intubation may be required, the HFNC or NIV should not be used to delay
Yes.
the intubation, because that can cause a big
the
problem.
the previous epidemic or pandemic that we have with the SARS or MERS, there is a strong correlation. If you use a non-invasive ventilation and it is failed, the incidence of morbidity and mortality in those patients who have a failed intubation has very high. So if you are using any type of non-invasive ventilation, that should be strictly monitored, and a short duration, every 30 minutes you monitor the patient for at least 2 hours or 3 hours or maximum 4 hours, and you have to take a decision whether the patient intubate or not. Delaying intubation will not only increase the morbidity but also increase the mortality in these patients.
Yes. Okay. There was an important question. I will come to Dr. Rahul for that. How important is the scavenging in OTs and ICU ventilators?
Okay, I'll come to IC ventilator first. In IC ventilator, if you are using HMEF, that is heat and moisture exchange filter, that is also having viral filtration rate of 99.999%. You have to use it in between the endotracheal tube and the circuit, and also you have to use expiratory filter, which has also the capacity of viral filtration. If you are using both of these two techniques, there is hardly any issue of transmission. It will not cause much damage. Same is with the OT ventilator. If you are using two HMEF, one at the junction in between the endotracheal tube and the Y piece, and the other towards the expiratory link, then you can use it, and there is no problem with it.
Yeah. So in this context, this use of these viral filters are very, very important. We always prefer to use the closed circuits in this group of patients. However, if at all you have to use at times any open circuit like a Bain circuit, always use these viral filters between the mask and the connector of the circuit, and preferably avoid ambu bag and mask ventilation. But even if you have to use at times, always place a viral filter just above the mask, between the mask and the ambu bag. And one more question was there regarding weaning. So any special concern regarding weaning and extubation of COVID patients?
Yes. When it comes to weaning, so if you are going for SBT, that is spontaneous breathing trial, it is preferable to go with a low pressure support or a SCT mode rather than TPS mode, because the chances of generating aerosol with this procedure will be less rather than going for a TPS. Anyway, as discussed, the spontaneous breathing mode with a low level of pressure ventilation is better than TPS as a mode of SBT. Another concern is that after weaning, if you plan for extubation, you have to take, extubation is again a aerosol generating procedure, so you have to take utmost care during the extubation process also. The patient should be calm and you do it smoothly, and it depends upon whether the patient is still COVID positive or not, and if you have a viral load report or not. If you don't have anything, you consider the patient as a COVID positive, and you take all the precautions of any aerosol generating procedure during the extubation. If you have a report that the patient is negative, then or the viral load is less, then you can consider the patient as a normal patient and go ahead with extubation. However, most of the time you should not delay extubation because to become the result of that COVID test to be negative, because that will itself increase the morbidity and mortality. You should ideally go to the extubation with all precautions.
Okay, so I think we have tried to answer as many questions as possible, and I hope that this webinar was really useful for the practitioners who will be working and dealing with the patients, these COVID patients in the ICU. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.